Hello, my friends, and welcome back to Artur Rehi Podcast. Today's guest is David from the Cold War channel and from the team from Kings and Generals. I'm sure you heard about those two channels. Both of the channels are in the description below. Hello, David, and welcome to the podcast.
Good morning, Artur. How are you today?
I'm good. How are you?
Doing very well, thank you.
Yeah, before I started recording, we just talked about how Scholz, the leader of Germany, announced the sending of Leopard tanks to Ukraine. What are your thoughts about this?
I think it's something that was going to happen eventually. Why it has taken as long as it has is, that'll be a channel, an episode that we can do on our channel in a few years when some of that documentation might actually see the light of day. But I think it's a huge step forward for the Ukrainians, and certainly in the ability, especially with the timing, given that it's the 25th of January right now. It's going to take a little bit of time, obviously, to have transfers set up and things moved into position. Logistics need to be sort of established and coordinated. But by the time things are fully online and there's been a bit of training, some time to acclimatize to new equipment, it should be a big help just in time for spring offensives to start getting going. Probably like timelines, you'd probably know better than I would, but I'd say probably March, April. I would say that's probably about peak effective time for the equipment transfers if they start right away. But should have a fairly sizable impact on the Ukrainians' ability to not just defend the line, but actually to move forward into an offensive position. So,
yeah, as much as I know now, the information changes, and by the time the podcast comes out, I have to say this information all is old and probably false. But as of now, EU countries together has perhaps promised about 80 Leopards, and USA as of now has promised, I think, about 30 Abrams tanks to Ukraine. But for them to use them, they need solid ground. Right now, it's soft, I think.
I think it depends where, like the farther north in the country, like Donetsk front looks a little more frozen. But I don't think it's not quite Rasputitsa, but it's not exactly frozen solid either. But yeah,
Honestly, it has felt like it has been Rasputitsa for months now, because I remember in September it was already raining and mud, and we got those videos. And when the war started, it was mud. Only in summer it was fully dry.
yeah. When you like the footage that obviously, I'm sure we'll talk about Bakhmut, but when you see the trench footage and everything in and around
Yeah.
Bakhmut, I think there's been very few days where things have been super frozen solid. You posted some awesome film a little while ago from I think it was Russian troops being asked to dig into to trenches that were just frozen solid with water. Um, but
Oh, yeah.
I don't think there's been too many days like that. And obviously, the further south that you go, getting closer to Crimea and to towards the south of the country, towards the coast, I think things are a bit more soft and certainly less frozen. So
And in the south is also, there's no forest there. There's like only fields. Even if you look at Google Maps, it's like these circular fields there. It means irrigation canals probably. So I think the rainwater is probably better led to the Black Sea, so it's not going to stay. I
yeah,
think
I
so.
think I haven't seen reports in terms of how much damage has been done to that type of irrigation, to the canals systems and whatnot. I think that's depending on the state of that will obviously depend on exactly how dry or water laden it is. But things will dry out eventually, and I'm sure the Ukrainians will put a lot of the new equipment that they're getting, the Bradleys and Strykers, certainly the Leopards, Challengers. I think the UK is committed to
Yeah.
at least one squadron of Challengers. Um, all of that should hopefully go a long way towards putting the Ukrainians on a really strong offensive footing come spring.
But as much as I'm an infantryman, I don't really have knowledge about tanks. But as much as I look at historians talking about this or experts, they say that tanks alone really don't do much. That they need artillery, they need infantry, and they need air power and everything.
Yeah, I mean, as much as Elon Musk would like to convince us that the age of the tank is dead, the age of the tank has changed, but it's certainly not dead.
Yeah.
Uh, Combined arms is always, I mean, that's always how tanks, from my reading of history, anyways, like, combined arms has always been the way forward. It's not armor alone. It has to be tanks supported by infantry, supported by artillery. Air superiority would go a long way towards contributing to success for Ukraine as well. But the seeming reluctance to really commit a lot of air defense systems, like a significant number of air defense systems, into the Ukrainian front seems to still be holding things back. But that's there seems to be, since last February, there's been this creeping red line of exactly what's okay to transfer and what's not okay. Hopefully, heavy armor will pretty much open the floodgates, and Patriots and more systems similar to that will start actually being transferred in. So
That red line you mentioned, I feel like, yeah, when the war started, I remember Estonia as a country wanted to give their Soviet-made howitzers, not Soviet-made, sorry, I think they were German-made, but they were really old, and Germany said no, and we had to really fight to send them, and now everybody's sending them, nobody cares, and now it's tanks, and actually, I think Belgium or the Netherlands have started to train Ukrainian pilots for F-16s, although no permission has been given.
well, I mean,
Send,
tra-
yeah.
you don't need permission to train them, but that's certainly the first certainly the first step in terms of being able to transfer to make that transfer. I've seen and heard arguments being made that it's like, well, can the Ukrainians learn how to use them? And I think that's a ridiculous argument. I mean, you can teach any soldier, given
Yeah,
teach any soldier to use any piece of equipment. Like it's a training aspect. They're it's high tech equipment, but they're designed to be used by soldiers in a combat environment. They're designed for people to be able to train on them. And I honestly, given what we've seen of the Ukrainian armed forces, I think they'd probably end up teaching the West a few things about exactly how to use some of these systems in combat. But no, I think the next hurdle beyond, now that heavy armor is being transferred in, is going to be aircraft, like advanced aircraft. So we'll see how long that takes to make it real, and to see who can possibly throw up roadblocks to try to prevent that. But we wait and see.
yeah. I mean, yesterday and the day before that, I think combined those 2 days, Russians lost, I think, about four Ka-52 alligators and about two Su-25s, I think.
I I I read that they confirmed there were three. That's the crocodile. I think there's three K-52s shot down inside the space of about a half an hour.
Yeah,
Considering that they only had 50, including um, training units, like that's a really significant blow
it is.
to their advanced. I mean, that's the most advanced
That's the newest one, right?
helicopter that they have. Yeah, that's the most advanced, newest one that they've got in theater. I think in inventory. But it's I'm very interested. I'm very curious as to the. We haven't seen a lot of like real air power. It's the words I'm looking for. We haven't seen a lot of like real challenges towards like one side or another trying to assert real air dominance, which I find really interesting considering from a historical perspective, certainly during the end of the Cold War, there was massive concerns and fear over the capabilities of Soviet anti-air systems, um, which maybe this is what's being played out now, that there's still this this concern over S-300s and S-400 systems, but we're not seeing a ton of significant air power trying to be asserted one way or the other. I think it's impressive that the Ukrainians are doing what they're doing with what they have, but the fact that the Russians aren't committing more air resources is I'm very interested to see what comes from that. So
Honestly, it feels like the Russians, if they have S-300s, S-400s, those systems I feel like can shoot down almost anything Ukraine has, because Ukraine has mostly Soviet tech in there, and vice versa. Also, Ukraine has S-300s and they have Western anti-air capabilities, and they can shoot everything down which Russia sends. So both of them are like in a locked state; they cannot really fly because, you know.
Yeah, I mean, what I would expect happening, this comes back to what we were just talking about, what I expect seeing is, along with increased air assets being transferred in, if there are F-16s going to be transferred in, other air platforms. I think F-16 is the only one that's being seriously talked about at the moment. But that should come with significant anti-aircraft defense systems as well. Because as you say, like it's working in tandem. They've got to work in combination. But I
Yeah.
mean, that's I think at the moment everyone's just sort of celebrating the fact that Schultz has decided that it's finally okay for Germany to supply some tanks. So
It's I don't really know much about Germany's internal politics, but I've read some things here and there that Germany has been lobbied throughout the years to be very, pro-Russian, and a lot of politicians have money in Russia and they have interests in Russia still. So this is why it's so slow to change.
yeah, the German government. I mean, it's certainly. I mean, Gerhard Schroeder, who's a former
Yeah.
chancellor, is sort of the key shining example of it's like you're chancellor for a few years, and then when you step down from politics, you go and sit on the board of, I don't know if it's Rosneft or which of the oil companies it is, but like he's sits on the board for one of the Russian oil and gas companies. The entire German economy over the last 30 years, certainly since unification, has very much been built around the concept of cheap Russian natural gas. It's, that's very much a foundational thing. The pipelines being turned off over the last year has hurt Germany, but from my understanding is that it's not to the extent that a lot of people feared, because they've been able to supplant and replace Russian gas with sources from other countries and other suppliers. So there's been a price increase, but it's not this. There's my dog in the background. It's not. It hasn't been the devastating complete shutdown of the German economy that some people feared back in February. The
Yeah.
fact that
No.
it's taken till January, it's almost. I mean, it's. I think actually it's 11 months yesterday that the war started. It's taken
Yeah.
11 months for that sort of realization to sort of be clued in, to be plugged in. I think is a sad state of affairs, but I'm not German, so I can't necessarily say what the fears are of that of having
I mean,
your
Russian
economy
Russian
shut down.
propaganda
But
was, the entire, even not only the Russians, but I think some people in America also living somewhere else except for Europe thought that Europeans are only dependent on Russian oil and gas. There's so much gas and oil in the world, so many countries that want this market and they're fighting for this market. So if Russia goes, 5 countries are like, take mine, take mine. We gotta
yeah,
just choose. That's how it is.
yeah, and that's exactly what I think what's happened over the last 11 months is that the Germans have figured out their supply, like how to transfer their supply contracts to other manufacturers, to other suppliers. There's I think an LNG, liquid natural gas
Yeah.
plant that's
Qatar
actually
is
come
here.
online. So it's things seem to be moving back in the right direction after a lot of dragging of heels. So it yeah, the German. I wonder as well, and I was having this discussion yesterday with a colleague. I think there's probably, I mean, there's a good 80 years of German education that has been teaching that that pacifism is good and war is bad, and that war with Russia is especially bad.
Yeah.
And that has to have. I think it's probably very difficult to quantify, but I'm sure that has some impact in terms of national psyche, in terms of how Russia is viewed, in terms of the risk of going to war with them. So
Yeah, I see German people, as much as I've talked to German people, they seem to have like this mental block of somehow thinking of weapons as things of necessity. I mean, our weapon is economy. You know, we're gonna be friends with Russia. We get free gas. This is our power, and it has been the power for the 50, 60 years. But now it's not, and now you need weapons, and it's so hard for them to think in these terms. Estonians are used to it. We're next to Russia, and we knew this was coming, but Germans, no.
It's interesting. I mean, the German armies. I mean, the West, obviously the West German army up until 1990, and then the United Bundeswehr, like after that combination, both the East and West German militaries were incredibly strong and incredibly powerful and really ready to go to war. I mean, that was sort of that was always the viewpoint, and that was how they were viewed in terms of NATO circles, in terms of Warsaw Pact circles.
Yeah.
But it's the last 30 years, I think, that strain of pacifism has really taken root and taken hold. And that's a full generation of I mean, I'm gonna say youth, which makes me feel like a really old man at the moment, but that's a completely other thing. But I think that's the reality of it. There's a whole generation of young Germans that have grown up not conceiving of war as anything that is possible, but knowing full well what the horrors of that are from the history books. Because the Second World War is taught very well I think still through the German education system. There's not a lot of glossing things over and trying to make things look like something that they weren't.
Which is how it should be, I guess. Yeah. But
I mean, speaking as a historian, yes, absolutely. But then
but we see the other side now, other effect of it.
we do. But I mean, I think the other side that we can look at as well is how the Russians teach the Great Patriotic War,
Oh,
where it's a really complicated subject, obviously.
like it's two different wars. If you see how Germans teach World War II and Russians teach the Народная война, right? It's
Yeah,
two
it's
different
it's
things.
it's very very different. I mean, the Russians teach it as this great patriotic moment, as which in there's validity to what they're teaching, but they're not teaching the horrors that went along with it, and
Yeah.
that's the challenge. So
I mean, yeah, they teach it as this one great nation against, the oppressor, the Germans, but actually it wasn't one great nation. It was occupied Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians, Ukrainians, Belarusians forced under the gun to go to Siberia. So there's so much that they're like pushing under the rug, never to talk about it.
and
And
I mean, at the root of all that has always been like 60 years of of great Russian nationalism, where it's the older brother, the leader of the brotherhood, like and as you said, like the tiny nations and the tiny nationalities to follow along and do what they're told, because Moscow knows better. So, but
yeah, you
but
you
here,
actually, sorry,
sorry,
carry
go
on.
ahead.
No, you went to Moscow, right? You told me.
I was working in Moscow on and off for about 6 months, in the late 1990s. So the late Boris Yeltsin years, before Putin came in and assumed power. So
I mean, for Russians, these are horrible years. How did you feel in Moscow then?
my perspective is as a Canadian with a Canadian passport and a ticket to go home, it was an adventure. Like it was,
Okay.
I was, I went there interested in Russia and interested in the Soviet Union. I come by this Cold War stuff honestly, I guess. It's a lifelong passion for me in terms of like learning about that and sort of making myself aware of what was happening through all of that. The chance to go to Moscow and sort of see a lot of that firsthand, it was an adventure for me, but it was very, very clear and very, very obvious, that for the majority of Russians at that point, like your everyday man on the street,
Hmm.
it was a really tough time. It was a really bad time. And in Moscow, things were better significantly better than they were when you started moving out of the, not even just out of urban areas. Like it was really different in Moscow than how it was. Moscow and St. Petersburg sort of was those tier one cities. But then if you went to Yekaterinburg or you went to Chelyabinsk, I mean, that's things got progressively. I keep wanting to say Nizhny Novgorod and call it Gorky because it's like when I look at my old maps, it also always says Gorky. But like you could like Nizhny Novgorod, like these cities that like there's a huge stark difference in terms of what the quality of life and availability and how people were living. And then once you left the city, then it was a completely different ball game yet again. I mean, it was, I don't want to say that it was like serfdom because I mean, one would think that it would be better than serfdom, but really quite, I mean, primitive access to things. Like it was really, really tough. So
Yeah, people are surprised in the West. They see Russians stealing these toilets and these washing machines, but Putin firstly mostly mobilized and searched for volunteers from the non-Russian, non-Slavic peoples, tribes, however you want to call these people, Buryats and the Mari people and all of these people, and they live far away from the centers, on the other side of the Urals, but actually they don't have toilets. They have holes on the ground, and they're used to like that.
the statistic, and I don't know the source on the statistic, but so I take it with a slight grain of salt, but the estimate is that 25% of Russians don't have like an indoor toilet.
They have an
And then
outhouse.
when you think of like what the urban to rural split is, I mean that's got to be mostly heavily concentrated in like in rural areas. I mean, as you said, like people are stealing, soldiers were stealing those things because they just don't have them. They don't have access to them. And
Yeah.
it's yeah, and that's what it was 30 years ago. Things haven't changed like that in 30 years.
Things have got a lot different in the big cities, though. Like, I visited St. Petersburg in 2017, and it's like any other European great city. You have McDonald's there, you have Burger King and everything, and it's shiny and filled with lights. You couldn't tell the difference. They even speak English on the streets there, they spoke. It's an open city. But outside of it, it's still the 80s.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's 1880s sometimes, but yeah, that's
1880s. My God, yeah.
I joke. No, it for as much. So the when I was there, like to go back to what we were just talking about, like when I was there, the Boris Yeltsin years were just absolute vodka capitalism. It was absolute insanity. And if you had dollars, like US dollars, or you had Deutschmark, you could do anything you wanted. There was no limits. If you could imagine it, you could do it. And then, but I mean that came at this tremendous cost to living standards. It came at tremendous cost to life expectancy. Like there's people suffered. And then, Vladimir Putin comes to power and he starts reasserting controls and he starts taking action to try to stabilize things and make things not quite so crazy. And he's doing that, and he certainly did that by means of authoritarian control. Some would say that he manufactured terrorist incidents in order to strengthen his own centralized powers,
Yeah.
and he continued to do that through the 2000s. Then the war with, it's obviously there's the second war with Chechnya that sort of took control of that and used brutal methodology to bring an end and a successful end to that. That moved to the war with Georgia, and then sort of like obviously the progression that we've seen in Ukraine from Maidan and Crimea and to the situation that's in play now. But for the Russian people who remember and who lived through the 90s, there was stability that he brought. Like I don't want to say that was the right thing to do because obviously it's I don't agree. Bold statement. I don't agree with totalitarianism. Like I don't think hopefully that's not too controversial as a thing to say. But I can I can appreciate why the Russian people would see that as favorable given the chaos of the 90s.
Oh yeah, and the chaos in the 90s, Russians Russians approached it differently than Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians. Like we are always been European minded, even under the Soviet Union, we're the most Western province or country of the Soviet Union were the most westernized, and people from Moscow came to Estonia to feel the Western
Yeah.
values and stuff like that. So for us it was obvious. The Soviet Union is over, all right, we're gonna start working, we're gonna dismantle the old systems, we're gonna build the new ones. It was a crazy time, but we went through it, and now we're in the EU and in the NATO. It's a very nice first world country. But Russians didn't. Uh, they didn't do it like that. They didn't. Yeltsin did the same reforms, but the people didn't accept them like that. They started eating each other up. People gobbled up these, with the privatization. They used it.
Yeah.
Vodka
The,
capitalism, as you said. Yeah.
my impression was always that the Baltic states leveraged their traditional connections to the Western countries. I mean, obviously, like there's strong connections to Germany and into Western Europe. In Estonia, good strong cultural connections to places like Finland, and across the Baltic region.
Yeah.
Um, and they leveraged that and correct me if I'm wrong, but like we're very much welcomed in and supported and helped, being
Yeah.
seen as Western countries. Prejudices die hard. Russia slash the Soviet Union, and you still see those names used interchangeably. Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
it's really interesting. I think prejudice dies hard, and I don't want to say that that it was revenge or sort of vengeance or anything, because I think that that is too harsh. But there wasn't a sense of trust and a sense of familiarity, that the West could bring to Russia in order to sort of help and to support. Like shock therapy was not about a gentle amount of support. It was all about just rip the band-aid off, and it's going to hurt, and then things will be fine.
Hmm.
Except that isn't reality in a lot of ways. Like it's like when things hurt, people react, and that's how the reaction went. I don't think that there was the levels of support, um, and assistance that were really what it should have been required to sort of more gently ease what was the single most fully communist, socialized country in the Eastern Bloc. There wasn't any nascent capitalism to work with. I mean, you saw that in places like Poland and East Germany and Hungary, where there was the pretense of private business. You didn't get that in the Soviet Union. So it
Yeah, I mean, in the Eastern European countries, not Russia, they kind of they didn't ease into capitalism, but Poland was in the '88, or which was the year when Poland had their Western movement with the Pope. I'm sorry,
oh, I mean, it started in the early 80s or late
'80s.
70s,
Yeah,
early 80s with
that was the
so
start of it already. They had decades.
Solidarność and Lech Walesa. It was 88 things. 88 things started to free up, and then 89, and Poland. Poland was a kind of a more I want to say gradual, but there was a staged sort
It
of
was more
release.
gradual than compared to
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
And also in Russia, it was a Moscow-based power. So Russians in Russia identifying as Russians or connected to Moscow, they felt they are in power, and they lost something. Estonia gained something. We gained the West, but Russians lost Estonia as a slave state. So there's a winner and loser here. They were the losers. That's why they're bitter, I guess, because we are very happy to be in NATO, and we won a great deal when the Soviet Union collapsed. Um,
yeah. And I think that's very true of several of the republics, like where it was, and certainly of like in the countries in Eastern Central Europe, like Hungary and Czechia and Slovakia and Poland. Um, the Baltic states absolutely were probably the biggest winners to reassert independence.
yeah.
Um, I'm not going to. I mean, there's a debate that I could We could probably get into whether they were actually ever not independent. Um, but that's one of those historical sort of footnotes that they never actually officially gave up their independence.
You mean the Baltics?
The Baltic republics that
But I mean,
they
they were
considered
SSRs, Soviet Socialist Republics.
they were, but there was I think it was Latvia continued to have independent diplomatic representation in London
Oh
through the
yeah, I mean we had
entirety
the
of the
same
Cold
thing in
War.
Sweden. Yeah,
Yeah,
it existed, but they had no power. They were just there for
none.
political statements.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
that's why it's a footnote, not a chapter. So,
I can see Estonian grandfathers like in the grave right now. I go, what did you say?
oh no, I'm sure the Vatniks will be coming after me soon enough. So that's
Yeah, but I'll take another topic that I've written down that I just right now looked at the news and it has been going around for like 5 to 6 days now that Erdogan is really tough on Sweden with the Quran burning and the whole Islamic faith, of course, should be. It's a very unholy thing to do and disrespectful. But what do you think? Can Sweden be accepted into NATO if Turkey is with such an attitude?
Turkey. I'm not going to say Turkey. Most of this stems, I think, from Erdogan. Erdogan is leveraging this to get as much as he can possibly get out of NATO. Sweden will join NATO. I don't think but
Yeah?
it's going to be, yeah, absolutely. It'll be a question of what Erdogan gets in exchange for this. Like Erdogan. There's elections in Turkey this year, presidential elections. Um, the Turkish economy is, I'm not going to say it's hurting, but it's stagnating. It's not seeing the growth that they would like. And it's foreign affairs and foreign relations is an easy card for Erdogan to play to give himself a stronger standing and a stronger impression that he's the tough man on international relations and look what he can do. He relies on a heavy Islamist base inside the country. Erdogan's also in a difficult position, and Turkey in general is in a difficult position because they do have a fairly strong and extensive and deep economic relationship to Russia. That they don't want to burn that bridge. Um, whereas, but they also want to maintain that bridge to Europe because there's money from both sides. Will Turkey stand down? Yes, there'll be some concession made. I couldn't tell you right now what that concession is going to be, but there'll be a demand at some point, and Turkey will grudgingly agree to remove their what's the word I'm looking for, Artur?
Veto? I don't
Yeah,
know.
thank you. Yes, they will grudgingly agree to withdraw the veto, and Sweden will join. So
Yeah, they have nothing against Finland, so Finland will join anyway. So the Baltic Sea will probably be NATO's internal sea, and Russia's Baltic fleet will have no purpose at all. They cannot do anything.
yeah, I mean
They cannot move.
it's a relatively small fleet to begin with,
Yeah,
but any freedom that they may have had prior to this, I mean, it's useless. What that means for Kaliningrad and what that means for St. Petersburg from a military standpoint, like obviously Kaliningrad has been a military outpost since the end of the Second World War. Um, St. Petersburg has been a traditional Russian port city, naval port for centuries since Peter established it. Um, what that means for the fleet, I mean, the Russians would be insane to continue to spend money and sink resources into it if they can't do anything with the ports from a military perspective.
yeah.
But logic and Russia don't always go hand in hand. So That's
Yeah, they pour resources in. Like Russia has money. It's clear they have oil, they have gas, they have everything. They have almost every resource you can think of. They have a lot of money. And if it would be a different system, they would be a very thriving nation. But it's Russian people that are the problem here, I think, and the mindset.
I would say it's a mindset and corruption. The corruption runs so deep and is so endemic within the country.
It's part of the culture almost.
Yeah, at this point, it
I'm gonna
very
say
much
this
is.
stuff so people go against me, you know.
No, no, I think there is definitely, I mean, Blatt as a sort of like this low level, like it's from just very low level like um, interactions where, I mean, petty corruption is built into social interaction and social transaction, and it
Hmm.
works its way up. I mean, that's, I when I was leaving Moscow in 1998, I messed up my visa was fine. I messed up my flights, and my visa expired a day before my flight was supposed to leave,
Oh,
which if anybody who's ever traveled to Russia, like, it's like if your visa says that you leave on this date, that's the day you need to be leaving. Or certainly that's what it was like in 1998. I messed this up, and I was going to have to go and sleep at Sheremetyevo at the airport, like clear customs and basically just sleep in the airport till the next day because I had to clear out that day. Except that my father knew somebody who worked. My father knew somebody who knew somebody who worked at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and for the price of a bottle of whiskey, a good bottle of whiskey, I had my visa changed, and I got to sleep. I got to sleep in a bed for the last night, and that was all fixed. But it's that type of like super low level interaction that then moves its way up through every level of doing business, every level of government, all the way to the top where you know, you've got Vladimir Putin in his billion-dollar mansion with gold toilets. Like that doesn't happen because you've gone to IKEA and gone shopping for furniture. Like that happens because you're stealing massive amounts of money.
yeah, money that can build schools, airports, bus stations, that can buy a bike for every children in Russia, every child, can buy a toilet for every person in
I was just
Russia,
about to
right?
say the indoor plumbing would be a big advantage for a lot of people, but
Yeah,
yeah,
and it's not that expensive. I mean, compared to the billions, and billions could fix everything almost, actually.
I think it was Mark Galeotti he's a commentator on Russian affairs. His latest estimate, or one that he provided from sources that he knows, is that Vladimir Putin's net worth is probably somewhere close to $1 trillion.
Oh my God,
And I
Elon
mean, I
Musk,
don't,
watch out!
I mean, I don't know what the stated salary for the president of Russia is supposed to be, but and I know he's
I
been in
know what
power
he
for,
officially owns. He owns a small flat in St. Petersburg and a lot.
yeah,
That's it, I think.
yeah, exactly. So it's but that's the unofficial estimates here is that he's close. He's probably got about $1 trillion in assets. I can only
You
dream of that
you
kind of
could
money.
rebuild
That's
Russia with his personal wealth. You'd rebuild
you.
the country. Yeah.
It's and that doesn't even count the oligarchs or the Siloviki that are around him. Like it's really the level of theft is is just off the charts. I can't even
And
imagine that.
and the whole system is geared that if some position is changed, the system doesn't change. So if there's another person coming to that position, he is automatically going to be stealing money, even if he doesn't want to. The wealth moves like that. It's the moving of assets is that's how it is in Russia. I mean, you cannot change it as one man. You have to dismantle the entire system and rebuild
It's
it.
interesting. I mean, the oligarchs are one thing, and I think certainly in the West, everybody talks about the oligarchs and like that's they hold so much power. Partly it's the oligarchs, but I don't think enough people are necessarily in the wider sphere talking about the Siloviki, who are it's probably about there's the estimates about 5,000 to 6,000 people that sort of hold all the levers of power like across the Russian Federation, and they all each basically personally owe their positions directly to Vladimir Putin. So he has these direct connections to these people that hold all the levers of power, and he plays them off against each other so that there's never any like uniting to form like some sort of coalition against him. And they all owe their their power and their wealth directly to him, and that's really how he maintains power. The oligarchs could act as a pull against him. They're often included amongst the Siloviki, but it's this larger group that really maintains control over the country, and he maintains control over them. It's very reminiscent of how Hitler, not that I want to make that comparison, but it's very reminiscent of the methodology that Hitler used to control Nazi Germany and the Nazi Party in the during the Second World War. So,
And in that system, a lot of resources poured into infighting and just rivalries and stealing, and all of this resource could benefit the people, but it's just going towards infighting. So it's just an inefficient system.
it's never about the people. I
Yeah.
mean, that. If I was ever to write a book about Russian history, that's probably what would be the Russia
If I,
history. It's never about the people. It's
that's a good
but
title.
but uh, but I mean that's very much. There's very few instances and examples through Russian history where things are being done. It's maybe a naive viewpoint, but things are being done strictly for the good of the people and for the benefit of society as a whole, as opposed to the benefit of the people in charge.
But I feel like part of this is because there is no society. People are apolitical. They don't identify as a democratic person who knows his vote, the value of his vote. I mean, in Russia, there's this silent deal that you don't go into politics and we don't go into your homes with, there is no active society in that matter. So,
There's certainly no culture of democracy as long as people's needs are being taken care of and things aren't being intruded on too much. Then
mhm.
people will keep their heads down and go about their daily lives, and nobody needs to say anything more. But when that starts breaking down,
Which it is
like
happening now.
when there's more conscripts, when there's more young people being scooped up and being taken out, when the comforts of daily life start not functioning or not appearing, that's a silent violation of the contract, and that's when trouble can start to present itself. I can't guarantee. I will never promise to say yes, this is actually what's going to happen, because I don't have a crystal ball. I don't have the magic 8 ball that I can shake and it'll tell me what's going to happen. But these are the conditions. There are conditions being created that lend themselves towards social unrest.
Oh yeah,
So
definitely. And some people in the West, of course, they're waiting for revolution because when French change the coffee prices, they're on the streets by the millions, but they're not the French. It takes time, a lot of time, and a lot of hunger. 1917, people were starving to death by thousands. And this is not the
but
case in Russia. It's not gonna be.
but 1917 took 3 years, took decades to get to those conditions. Like, that's
Yeah.
people lived and suffered with that for literally for decades.
And probably a million people have died of starvation altogether with those decades. The number
Yeah.
would be huge if somebody would put it together.
Yeah. So I don't I see things on Twitter, I see things on other social media channels talking about, it's like, oh, like, the revolution is starting, like, it's like
Mm,
the end is coming, like, rejoice. And it's just like, no,
not yet. Yeah.
like, settle in. It's a long ride.
According to Western standards, it would be. Yeah, people look at it as if the Russians would be French, who are very socially active and have been from the revolution. They are the
Yeah.
changer of values in Europe. But it's Russia. They're used to suffering. It's a horrible thing to say, but it's part of the culture to suffer for the Tsar.
I can't, I'll be honest though, Artur, I can't even say that it's like, that it's just the Russians. Like, I mean, I'm Canadian. I live in Toronto, and I look at some of the things that are happening here that people don't, it's like they sort of like, oh, like, I don't like this. and then people put their heads down and like they go about it and they just deal with the consequences. If I
Hmm.
lived in France, I mean, I'm pretty sure that there'd be tractors and like, blocking the streets and tires on fire and like,
Yeah.
yeah, like it would be absolute pandemonium if half of the things that happened here in Canada. Like, so I can't necessarily, I don't want to say that it's like, say, Russian characteristic to sort of to sit and to suffer. I think to me, the French are very much they're exceptional. I wish more
Yeah.
people would sort of be more vocal and be more,
I used to
get out
make
there.
fun of, yeah. I reacted to history memes. That's how my like English YouTube channel started. And it's like, oh, French white flag stuff like that, weak people. No, and I made fun of that. They come to the streets if coffee prices change. A baguette, you know. Estonians are strong. They don't show emotion. But now I see each strength in democracy what they have. People are so active and they believe in their own power that they change the governments. That's
Yeah, it's
honorable.
like if they see something that they don't like, they let people know.
I
Why
love it.
why sit and suffer in silence? So that
Yeah.
we there we go. That's we should all be more French. I never thought I'd say that.
I'm gonna bring my white flag out, so I'm more okay. I'm sorry, French people. I honestly really respect the country, especially after I see this. After this war, I see how Russians react to suffering, and I see how French react. It gives more points to the French. They change their own governments with these protests.
Don't put up with crap. I mean, that's,
Yeah.
if you're unhappy, like go and say something, do something about it. So
Burn some
I don't mean
tires
to.
on the street.
This is, yeah. Are we going to spark a revolution here? That's not my intent, but that's
If you
I,
can, do it.
I'm Canadian. How about a nice quiet protest? That's
Hey, same with Estonians. We're on the same latitude with the winters, so I guess that affects a little bit.
no protest between December and March. That's it's too cold.
And and no protest after also because you want to enjoy the short summer you have.
Right. That's always take advantage of the whatever good weather you get. So, but
Yeah, I mean, the Nordic people are naturally more quiet and more preserved, and Estonians are especially well known, and Finnish also suffering in silence, and it's thought of as a strength. I don't see it as a strength. I see it as a weakness, actually, because you cannot change things if you're silent.
I'm of the mind and of the opinion that if if you're unhappy with something and you don't like something, be vocal about it, agitate. I'm Canadian, so be polite about it. Don't
Yeah,
don't be too French, but that's but certainly like I mean you gain nothing by not speaking your mind, and you gain nothing by not making people aware that a change would be beneficial. So
yeah, and it's weird because of course some people will use it for their own advantage. We have in Europe there's a surge in right wing politicians, and they are very populist. They use these sentences very short and very you know how they manipulate the masses, and they can do it because there's democracy and it's allowed, and the governments allow them to do it. So, and that's unfortunate, but I guess it's part of democracy, and you cannot do anything about it.
it's a part of democracy, but when only 30 to 40% of people might like lend some sort of support towards that viewpoint, that's still a majority of people who may be divided amongst their own particular political, like, political splits and whatnot. But that's still a majority of people who disagree with with what those ultra right people, I shouldn't even say ultra right, but the right is saying. That's the situation that we have certainly in Canada, is that there's a very vocal conservative party and a conservative, group of Canadians, and hey, that's fine. Like that's, definitely, like, say your piece and espouse say what you need to say and believe what you need to believe. But they hold maybe 35% of the vote. That's still 65% of the people that don't sit on the conservative side of the spectrum, and they're sitting across two other parties on the center and the left. So, and I know things are even more fractured. There's many, many more political parties I find in most European countries than there exists in certainly in Canada, and definitely compared to the United States. But
I
That's
mean, the more parties you have, the more different views can be represented in the parliament.
yeah, that's
I think
I
so.
don't I will plead ignorance that I don't know too much about domestic Estonian politics, but
How can you not know?
that's
No, no,
I'm
Estonians
sorry.
don't really know.
I'm
But
sorry.
I think we have about six major parties, 5 to 6 ones, and then we have a bunch of very small ones which have like 3% of the votes and 4% of the votes.
Right.
But I guess that's a healthy democracy when you have like five parties and people are really infighting to like for small things. The smaller the things are that people fight about, the better the state of the country.
I mean, if everyone's fighting over the really, really big things, then you probably have problems.
Yeah, yeah. So if I see
So,
those really stupid topics and we have votings coming up, and people are like, the issues are small because everybody agrees we got to support Ukraine. This is the big one, and everything else is kind of like. Then I say, okay, we're in a very good state because the issues they're fighting about are stupid. That's what it, you know.
so I'm going to ask you a question because I'm not sure about this. Like there's a significant Russian minority that live in Estonia. Where
Yeah.
does their support lie with the war?
They also are split. Some of these Russians are Russians by culture, but they feel Estonians. They live in Estonia. They never want to go back to Russia, and they support Estonia. And some of these Russians still watch Putin's news and watch Russian media, and they are silent and silently pro-war and silently against Estonia. But they are silent because the hatred is so seeable. You can smell it. You can feel it. If you're Russian in Estonia who is pro-war, I would say you're afraid, honestly, for not for your life, but
Oh,
afraid. So they're silent.
interesting. That's
Yeah.
I think it's the 30% of the population is Russian by heritage, like whether
But
that's
out of those 30, about I don't know the numbers, but I would say
yeah.
about 10 is strongly pro Estonian and like pro Ukraine, and out of those 20 that is left, some are apolitical as Russians are, and only those small percentage which is left is maybe like strongly feels that they're pro-war. And Estonian police is very strict with it. If they see the Z symbol, if they see some pro-war sentiments, they react immediately. They react, and there's no gray area here. Yeah,
No, I mean it's a country that has a rich and firsthand knowledge of Russian imperialism. So
yeah, yeah.
that's thank you. That's I hadn't thought of that, like sort of what that situation looked like in Estonia or the Baltics. So, but
Yeah, I'm in the capital right now, but before I lived in Tartu, it doesn't matter which city you go. It's like every house that has some kind of lighting, it's Ukraine flag. Every big city building they have. It's weird to think that we have this electricity crisis or the prices are really high with electricity, and then everybody blasts Ukrainian flags with their lights. And I'm glad to see this, but it's a bit weird and bizarre to watch.
it's it's my biggest fear through the my biggest concern through like since the war started is obviously at the beginning there's a massive huge upsurge of like support Ukraine and do whatever it takes and it's like beat Russia, etc. The
Yeah.
longer the war drags on, the more fatigue sets in, and
Oh yeah.
the more people lose interest um, in paying attention to what's going on and sort of seeing what the outcome and hoping for a positive outcome for Ukraine. Um, I think that's a really big concern for a lot of people, myself included, to see, especially the farther away from Russia and the farther away from Ukraine that you go, the more that fatigue is likely to set in. So,
I can definitely see it in my viewership. You know, of course I'm a military blogger, I'm a patriot, but also it's my living. So I see the views and I see the comments, and the activity has come down from. I would say the high point was September, November, December when Izium was taken, the Kharkiv offensive, the Kherson offensive, and after that it has very slowly been going down, like very slowly and gradually. The interest in this war.
I'm going to speak sort of off the cuff here, and if this is a poor attempt at humor possibly, but once the spring offensives start and there's more action and there's more sort of big movements on the map, then I would expect that viewership will sort of pick up again. Um, seeing seeing which 100 meters of Bakhmut was fought over in the last week is
Yeah.
some people don't want to watch that. So
That's why I don't report that anymore. I stopped way before like Denis Davidov. We have Denis is doing every day. You know Denis, right?
yeah,
Like the Ukrainian military. He's the biggest one. He does it every day, and it's almost always the same, and people really watch him. So I guess he has something. He manages to make it interesting. But for me personally, as you said, 100 meters there, 100 meters back, it doesn't even play a role in the military perspective. In the For the people there, it doesn't play a role. So
that's
mm,
no, it's that when Soledar was finally captured 2 weeks ago, whenever that was.
yeah,
I think outside of people who are really paying attention, it doesn't even register. It's not. I mean, Soledar is important to the people of Soledar, absolutely, but in the broader perspective, it's not Kherson.
yeah.
It's not this like huge swath of territory where there's big changes on the map. It's
It
we're
honestly
we're
feels
talking
like
1916 type like changes in of lines. It's crazy.
I just wanted to say, like, all quiet on the Western Front. I mean, of course, they said all quiet on the Western Front, and the people in the Western Front, a lot happened. The people died every day, but at the grand scale of the war, it didn't matter much.
Yeah. It I think things again coming back to this. I think in the spring, I think we're going to start
Yeah.
seeing some more significant changes on the map. Um, it'll be a I'm be very curious to hear your opinion. I think it's going to be a race to see who can launch an offensive first, whether it'll be the Russians in the north or the Ukrainians in the south. But
Yeah, I think the Ukrainians, they want to reach the sea because that would take everything from Putin, his land
yeah,
corridor to Crimea, and that would be such a blow that the army,
I
the morale
yeah,
suffering and stuff like that. So,
I think Berdyansk is going to be that'll probably be that sort of that angle of approach coming down towards Berdyansk. But
hmm,
I mean that just from a quick look at the map, that seems to make the most sense for me. The
yeah.
Crimea is the goal. If you're Zelensky and you're sitting in Kiev and you're watching all of this, Crimea is the Putin dying or isolating and recapturing Crimea. That's that's the that's the goal of everything that's happening in this.
But yeah, Crimea, I agree. But Putin dying wouldn't. I don't honestly think it would change anything about this war. Knowing how Russian system work, only a person who is similar to Putin can assume his position. Otherwise, he would be eaten up. Is
I, I don't think that there's anyone with enough personal power and clout to be able to step into that role and
Yeah,
maintain
sure.
and maintain control.
There would be some kind of infighting or a civil war. I mean, there's a potential for this right now.
Uh,
Actually, there are private armies going around in
yeah,
Russia.
I've seen I have seen speculation. I've had people tell me that I'm wrong and that this will never happen, and that's fine. It's future telling. So I, I'm I believe that the Russian Federation is going to break into smaller units after Putin dies. Like that's I don't think there's going to be a strong man with enough power and enough influence to be able to step in and maintain control over the whole federation.
And that would be a great outcome for every country bordering Russia, I think.
A weakening of Russian power and power projection would certainly I'm sure would make countries like Estonia and Ukraine feel a lot better and a lot more secure.
Yes.
I don't know if another Russian civil war, which is a potential outcome. I don't know how much that benefits anybody, given no one knows the status of nuclear weapons. No one knows. There's a lot of variables that go into it. Um, but I think the a minor breakup of the Russian Federation is probably should have happened in 1991. There, but there wasn't enough energy, there wasn't enough political will inside the Russian Federation to be able to do it at the time.
And also Chechnya tried, Dagestan tried, and they were
Yeah,
forced back. So,
yeah. But I could see Buryatia trying to I mean Chechnya absolutely, because if Putin goes, then Kadyrov and his clan goes. Um, I could see
Dagestan, yeah.
Ingushetia, Dagestan. Like there's
And Buryatia and Ingushetia, they're huge areas of land. They're not they're not small. Some tribes in Russia.
no,
They're huge areas of land. They would be bigger countries than the Baltics combined.
yeah, smaller populations,
Oh yeah,
but
definitely.
in terms of land size, in terms of possibly, and even in terms of access to resources,
Yeah,
there's really significant chunks of territory there. I I expect to see, if not full independence, then certainly significantly increased autonomy, and breaking away from Moscow. How that all plays out and how that breaks out, I mean, obviously that's a question for the future, and you can invite me back on in a couple of years, and we can dismantle this and see how right or wrong I was. But I fully expect to see that's something to expect to happen
yeah, same here.
once Putin dies. So
All right, I think this is a very good time to end the podcast, and I really enjoyed this. Like talking to you was really, really a blast, man.
thank you very much, Artur. I really appreciate the opportunity to come on and chat about this. This is great. I love talking about this stuff, and talking with someone who's so intimately associated to it and with a personal connection, obviously, to it. It's fantastic. So thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thanks, man. And to the viewer, the Cold War and the kings and generals, I'll put them in the description, but honestly, they don't need introduction. I think everybody watches them who is a little bit even interested in history. My friends, thank you for watching, and if you like these podcasts, subscribe to the channel. I'll see you next time. Slava Ukraini.